It was such an exciting thing to be part of that first foray into the wilderness. I mean, you brought up the frontier. It is much less the Wild West now than it was before.
Welcome to the CureGRN podcast. We exist to bring together families, doctors, and researchers to work together towards a cure. And now on with the show.
Hi, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, From Trials, Setbacks to Strategic Comebacks, Next Steps After a Failed Trial. Hi, I'm Wanda Smith. I'm with CureGRN, and I'm delighted to moderate this conversation. As many of you know, GRN, or progranulin-related FTD, is one of the genetic causes of FTD, contributing to dementia in individuals typically between the ages of 40 and 84. Increased awareness, early diagnosis, and a strong community support are essential for families navigating this difficult journey. So today, we're honored to be joined by Dr. Chow, a behavioral neurologist who's been at the forefront of efforts to improve the recognition of FTD, strengthen diagnostic pathways, and support families affected by the disease. Dr. Chow was on the critical development team at Alector, where she was on the front lines of helping advance innovative therapeutic approaches. She has served in multiple leadership roles, bringing the clinical and research communities to ensure that patients and families remain at the center of the scientific progress. So let's start from the beginning.
Well, thank you. I just want to say thank you so much for bringing me in, Wanda. This is such an important cause, and whoever we can make more aware of what's going on in our field, the better. And it's an exciting time.
It really is. And you've been such a true champion for FTD families in the neurological space, which spans from scientific trials to clinical trials to the bedside. So what really inspired you to take on this mission?
I will say that the frontal lobes are actually my favorite part of the human body. I remember having little debates in medical school, like the kidneys are more important. No, the brain is more important. Well, I was on the side of the brain because for humans to interact successfully together and to be happy and productive and to make the world a better place, it is the frontal lobes that help you to read social signs, whether the person you're talking to is getting bored, whether you are talking too much. It helps you make wise decisions that consider what future long-term outcomes might be. It also helps us to be more rational when we're trying to make scientific decisions, looking for evidence to support what we're recommending that patients do. So I was always interested in the frontal lobes, and when I found out that there was a dementia that attacks specifically the frontal lobes, it raised all kinds of questions for me, like, is that person the same person when they have FTD or frontotemporal degeneration? Because their judgment is different. Their way of relating to other people is different. And then, on the flip side of the same coin, this idea of how do families and friends adjust to such a big change? And what keeps them devoted to helping this now stranger get through the rest of life? It's horrible to see somebody go through this, but the silver lining on the cloud for me as a clinician was to learn how families get through this together. It's hard. It's really hard. And when I realized that we have no FTD-specific medications, I naturally got into clinical trial work because if you want to help your patients, yes, I can hold your hand. I can try to explain to you what's going on. But as the physician, I owe it to you to figure out what we can do to try to slow this down or stop it. And that's how I became someone who helps to plan clinical trials. The whole journey of discovering a possible mechanism of action to bringing that in front of the FDA to get an approval. It's a long journey. A lot of people involved, a lot of smart people throwing themselves at a complex situation. And it has to go through some steps of evidence bearing so that when somebody finally writes a prescription for this, and you take it over to your drugstore, you're reasonably assured that this actually does something for the condition and that it's safe and tolerable for you to take. And that's all the little tiny baby steps that have to happen before we get to a prescribable drug. And it's frustrating because it is so slow. I think a lot of the people in my clinic were participating in research because they wanted to help people who were going to come behind them. And with GRN-FTD, that means you're doing it for the rest of your family.
It really does. And thanks for explaining that journey, because I don't think we all really capture how long the journey is and the different elements and components that are needed to get over the finish line with this. So we're going to talk a little bit about the Alector trial specifically, and it did not meet its endpoints. Can you kind of explain that to us in layman's terms, if you could?
Sure. Let's take a look at the baby steps piece, because that helps to explain it. The first step that a drug company or industrial sponsor needs to present to the FDA is what we call phase 1. Actually, no. Before that, there's the preclinical phase. So we've tested this in animals that we are reasonably sure reflect the changes that happen in FTD. And the animals had a change that confirms that this drug acts in the way that we have hypothesized it would. After the preclinical animal testing, you are kind of guessing at the dose that will be safe and tolerable for humans to take. So a phase 1 clinical trial with that title, it looks that way in clinicaltrials.gov. A phase 1 clinical trial is the first attempt to use that candidate therapy in humans. And it's really important because if people have really bad side effects at phase 1, that drug will never go on to the next step. Phase 1 is a very small number of people, and they don't necessarily have FTD. They are young people who are really healthy because we don't want to risk that people will not be able to tolerate this initial attempt at administering the drug. If all goes well in phase 1, you go to phase 2, which means then you're actually involving people who have the disease of interest, FTD, GRN. And the idea there is not to provide enough evidence that the FDA will approve the drug flat out. It is to show that there is safety and tolerability in the target population. So phase 2, also very important, and we'll come back to this later when we're talking about the finances of clinical trials. Phase 3 is when it's showtime. We're going to get a really large number of people, often 1,000, to take either placebo or the drug that we're testing. And sometimes those two groups will switch what they're taking. And that is the evidence that we're trying to build to get the FDA to say, we're sold. Yes, go ahead. We approve this drug. The endpoints are in some ways, the racehorses on which we're gambling. There are a lot of things to measure when someone has FTD. The change that they have in behavior over time, how much food they're eating or not eating, how they're sleeping, what their cognitive function is like. And any one of those could be an endpoint. But the FDA makes the sponsors, the drug makers, pick one, the primary endpoint, which will be the deciding factor in terms of, yes, we approve this, or no, we don't. The endpoint has to show that the drug, as intended, made some kind of difference for the patient. And this is the part that I want patient advocacy group people to really hear. The primary endpoint needs to be clinically meaningful to the patient and their families, the people they're living with. If the primary endpoint is a change in a chemical, that doesn't necessarily mean that they're going to be able to have a nice Thanksgiving dinner with you. So we need the scientists to say, these are the things that are likely to change when the person's taking the drug. And we need patients and families, advocates, to temper what we're proposing to the FDA so that what comes out the other end as an approved drug is something that you will actually benefit from. Secondary endpoints, exploratory endpoints are where we group all those other things that we can measure that might be indications that we have made an impact to stabilize the illness or reverse it. At this point in history, We're just looking to stabilize. Treat early and stabilize so that people don't decline to a point where they're very dependent on other people.
I heard a beautiful story from a mom whose child was in a wheelchair, and they'd gone through a particular study for a genetic childhood disease. And I guess that particular trial didn't meet its chemical endpoint. But for that mom, she said it met her expectation because the child was able to move his thumb and could direct his wheelchair in a way that entertained him so she could make dinner. So I understand that's very good description you're giving us about what the endpoint in is and how, as a consumer, we can look at endpoints from behavioral, and the scientists can look at it from the clinical and the chemical. That's great. So can you describe for families who participated, what contributions did their involvement in the Alector study? What did it add to the field?
It added so much innovative information. As someone who was working with Alector, I thank you all for participating. I thank you all if you considered participating, but for whatever reason, you could not eventually be one of the clinical trial participants. It means so much to the people who are trying to develop the candidate therapies. The folks that we're trying to help are coming forward and saying, we trust you to test this on us. I think the word guinea pig has been used in a very negative way for people to be afraid of clinical trials. And I think one of the good things about all those baby steps to FDA approval is that each of those stopgaps is a safety check, a safety for the people involved in the study to be reasonably assured that we don't know that this hurts you. If we knew that it would hurt you, we wouldn't give it to you.
It would be, yeah, if there was a real safety risk, it would be stopped immediately.
Exactly. And there's a lot of what we call pharmacovigilance in the field, so that every time someone has an adverse event during the study, we follow up on it and we keep track of trends, because if a lot of people are starting to have the same problem, likely due to the medication, so we need to go back to the drawing board. This back and forth requires a lot of patience and resilience, and I would say that that's what our trial participants are giving us. They are suspending disbelief and boldly taking on the extra burden of more office visits, being examined, being asked questions. And because we need to follow people over time using the same questionnaires to show change, it's a lot of work. It's a lot of work for the site, but it's a lot of work for the patients and families. So when you sign up, we try to warn you, this is going to add up to a lot of time, possibly travel, and are not allowed to reimburse you in an amount that would seem coercive. There are lots of regulations that we can't lure people into the study just because they might need the money, and otherwise they wouldn't be in the study. We want people who are sure that there is a possible benefit from the medication, but we don't know, you don't know, we all won't know until the study ends.
Okay.
It's a leap of faith.
It really is. And I find that our families from CureGRN who are in clinical trials, they're like pioneers going across the Wild West. They really
Absolutely.
are. They're in the forefront of discovery, and their commitment is just absolutely amazing for me to watch and to see. So there's talk about the biomarkers. We hear that often. Can you give us a layman's terminology as to what is a biomarker and what does that mean?
I think the most important thing about a biomarker in terms of getting a drug approved or conducting real research is that a biomarker is something that we can measure on you or from you that is objective. So I don't have to worry that you think you're getting better, but that's your opinion. I need something that's in black and white showing me a change in the right direction, whether the right direction is up or the right direction is down. There are fluid biomarkers and imaging biomarkers relative to frontotemporal degeneration. Fluid biomarkers might refer to getting your blood drawn or having us do a lumbar puncture so we can look at the cerebrospinal fluid, which is that fluid that is telling us more than the blood can, systemic blood can, about what chemicals in your brain are up or down or interacting with each other. So there's fluid biomarkers, and then there's imaging biomarkers. People who have been working with FTD for a while all understand that the change in size, the loss of volume of frontal and temporal lobes, is something that we expect to see in patients who have FTD-GRN, especially. And so theoretically, you could use the volume of the brain as a biomarker of progression of the disease. For the advanced biomarker person, it's an important distinction between a biomarker that says, yes, this person has the illness, or at what point is this person in the illness. Those are two different things. And that's why the research in FTD and the clinical development of drugs is not on fire going real fast yet, because we haven't identified exactly the biomarkers that can do either of those jobs until it's very advanced time into the illness.
So our families are not only helping by their participation to advance drug development, but also this biomarker research.
Absolutely.
It's more than a one-off. It's a multiple ripple effect.
And
So
if I can come back to the Alector study, had people enrolled for 2 to 4 years with regular check-ins to measure biomarkers, answer questions about how things were going at home. How do you feel? Are you having any side effects? This is the first regularly collected longitudinal data set in FTD-GRN of its size. That is huge. So even though the trial found that there was no significant difference between the people taking the drug and the placebo performance, you've created a foundation for which other sponsors can move forward. That is an amazing step. That is a success. And actually, I'm going to call you on the title of this program. Technically, we did not fail in the clinical trial.
okay,
What they say is we didn't show a difference between drug and placebo, but we succeeded in enrolling the needed number of patients with a rare disorder to do a statistically competent analysis of the data over time. We got a lot of our participants through to the end of the trial to get the before and after endpoints. That's really important. And it doesn't happen as often as we want in clinical trials for patients with dementia.
so it showed we're team players, that
We sure are.
together we make it happen. So what would you say to the families who feel discouraged or hesitant about enrolling in future trials?
Number one, sponsors who are coming behind Alector can now learn from what went well, what might have been able to be improved, to pick new endpoints for their candidate therapies. And they have a better sense of how long it takes for things to change and how long patients and families can stay in clinical trials. I think I've mentioned before that it takes patience, it takes resilience to stay in the field of drug discovery, but it also takes, in order for us to actually help the patient population, it takes a lot of trial and error. That's why it takes so long, and sharing, collaboration. And so the research roundtable that AFTD conducts annually brings the sponsors in the space together. And one of the thrilling things for me was to see that every year there were more sponsors sitting at the table. There are so many sponsors who have been lured into FTD because Alector was going forward and meeting all these important milestones to show that clinical trials can be done. And Wanda, I think you have some information about how people can learn more about the other sponsors and clinical trials.
Yes, on CureGRN, there is a link to the Progranulin Information Navigator, and that's funded by the Bluefield Project, and it keeps up to date with all of the clinical trials that are actively enrolling. They also provide genetic counseling and genetic information and also genetic testing. So it's a great resource for our GRN families to get involved and to learn as much. Maybe your decision point isn't yet, but learning about this so that when you're ready to be involved and engaged in either the testing piece, counseling piece, or also actually involving, you know where the locations are, you know who the PIs are, the principal investigators, you know a description of what the product is, and you have a good understanding of what the eligibility, because we're not all eligible for all of the clinical trials. So it's a nice deep dive and an easily accessible site that's user-friendly. So I find our progranulin families really enjoy going to the Navigator and just surfing to see what's out there, because we now have 6 that are active and families are looking to learn about what's out there that they can actually engage in. I wanted to kind of get a little feedback from you. What do you hear from from participants about the day-to-day experiences of being in a trial? I mean, you've kind of been right there listening to families. Can you walk us through a little bit of that day-to-day experience?
I think what I have learned is that participating in research, whether it's observational research like being part of GenFi or being part of LFTD, allows people to find a meaning behind something in their lives that's happened that they didn't want to happen. It's really inspiring. I'm getting chicken skin talking about it. That how humans with frontal lobes that are working turn a disaster or something really painful into something meaningful. I think at the end of life, the people that I have escorted to that point have had some satisfaction that they did something that helped other people in a way that may be short-term or long-term. And when you participate in research, especially for a rare disorder like FTD, you're making such a huge contribution. At a low level, I'm doing something. I'm not just sitting here watching my brain change. That's great. But another thing that I really like, and actually I have to put a shout out to my friends at Penn.
They're a great group.
The people who go into FTD as a subspecialty are so dedicated to making a difference for this patient population. And so when you sign up to be in the clinical trial at their site, you get to see them more often. And their staff gets to work with you more often than on a regular clinical appointment. And that's a bonus for a lot of people. And I think for study partners and caregivers, family members, or even friends, it's nice to have an opportunity to ask more questions. And although there's only a certain amount of information that will come back out from the study to the participant or the family at the end of the study, it's just kind of nice knowing that somebody's keeping an eye on you when you feel like you're not sure what tomorrow is going to be like when you wake up.
Yeah, it's those relationships really matter. And also the journey is so complicated. It is like climbing rocks, we often say in the field. And so being with well-informed, well-meaning, and just very kind people has made a big difference. And you were talking about the way that the contributions and how wonderful it is that GRN families have been so active. I think the other piece where they really shine is how many of them are selecting autopsy as an end-of-life option so that the families actually become part of real meaningful advancements in science in so many ways. And clinical trials is certainly one area, autopsies is another area. And, joining groups to advocate like CureGRN and AFTD, I think also just gets us all together moving in the right direction.
Okay, you brought out autopsies. I have to give a shout out to another subspecialty in medicine that I've always had a special place in my heart for, neuropathology. Neuropathologists that I have met, especially the ones who study FTD, they're a whole different level of rigor and obsessive compulsive pursuit of answers. So if you give your brain to any of the centers of excellence who are researching dementia, I assure you that tissue will go a long way to helping other people. It's a huge gift, and it's so important.
It makes a difference. I mean, no matter how you look at it, that contribution with the plasma donations, the spinal, the participating in all FTD, the opportunities for us to join science and be a part of it I think is just, it's a wonderful partnership, but it also drives us faster to the cure, or at least some form of treatment. So, Dr. Chow, can you describe, how might a participant find out what was learned, from any study that they're participating in? I think there are things what are the expectations and how might that work?
That's a really important point that I'm going to hope future participants look for in the informed consent. Study organizers should be indicating to you, you don't get any information back, and then it's your choice to decide whether that's okay with you, or we will tell you the following things at the end of the study. Usually, we won't release any information to the participant or to the referring physician, the treating physician, until the study has ended, because we don't want to bias you, your family, or your treating physician to feel like either the diagnosis has changed or that you're getting better or you're getting worse. So usually the minimum give back will come to the participant from the study site, because the sponsor, the drug company, is not allowed to know who you are by name or your contact information. You like that. That's good. So what you can get back is the diagnosis under which the participant came into the study, whether the participant received the drug candidate, sometimes at what dose they received it, or whether they were on the placebo. Sometimes people get the impression they're on one or the other, but it turns out they were on the one they weren't expecting to be. So that's actually a nice nugget of information. The sponsor will reveal the placebo versus drug participants to the sites, and then the sites roll out that information. Sometimes companies will allow some kind of high-level summary statement of whether the participant declined or improved on cognitive testing during the study, but they won't give you the gory details of exactly what your scores were on every test at every testing point. There could be a description of change in brain structures over the course of the study. That's, again, not the actual images of your brain, but a qualified response of, yes, you did have some atrophy, or no, you didn't. How many other participants completed the study? That actually arrives in the public, what do they call it? PR. The PR about the study that appears in the newspaper. And the rest of the information, how many people dropped out of the study, how much people changed as a group, that's revealed in a publication. And sometimes it takes a year for that publication to see the light of day. Some of the information that doesn't appear in that publication is considered proprietary by the sponsor. If they're going to take the drug and alter it a little bit and then try again, then they don't want to give too much of an edge to the competition. I think this is an interesting subfield of neurology where there's so little available for families with FTD that sponsors are probably more willing to share information than they might be on a different front. And here's something I want to mention that's an opportunity for patient advocacy groups to decide whether they want to push sponsors to do an exit interview. An exit interview can be structured in many different ways, but it's different from the primary endpoint. The primary endpoint was designated and set in stone, disclosed to the FDA, and then you either made it or you didn't. But the exit interview is a way at the end of the patient's participation to see how they felt the study went, if they did think they got better or worse in ways that were not elicited onto the questionnaire forms that the study coordinators are administering to you. What were these other unspeakable things, like my son can move his thumb, therefore I can make dinner? We don't have an endpoint that looks like that. Not yet anyway. But these are the things that can be very clinically meaningful, and FDA will listen to a significant change that has been elicited on the exit interview. It can sort of help weigh the yay or nay. So that's an important piece that some clinical trials include already, and maybe more can soon.
Okay, so we want our consumers of progranulin, we want them to read the informed consent, have a very clear understanding for what that means. We as a group at CureGRN, we want to work with sponsors to help them realize that conveying information back to us is meaningful. And it also generates an excitement for people that their contribution can really deliver something back to them, during this span of time. I know that the trial was 4 years, and I often think about that's 4 years of like being in the wilderness with the clinical trial. So having something that the family gets back, I think is very, very constructive and very helpful. So what if they're done now with the study? It might have been some of the others that they're participating in, and they want to do another trial. How does that work?
So the general rules of engagement are, number one, you can't go from one therapeutic intervention trial, a drug trial, directly into the next one. Like you can't end Sunday and then pop into a new one on Monday. There's usually a cooling off period because we don't want any confounding of, was that adverse event, was that side effect from the drug number one or the one that you just started recently. So there's a cooling off period that can be anywhere from 6 months to 1 year. In the space of FTD-GRN, we don't have so many trials going that there's something for Alector participants to jump into, right this second. There isn't something for Alector participants to jump into right away. So the waiting period is not so much of a concern here. The second consideration would be, has there been so much progression of the illness that now you don't meet the eligibility criteria for the second study? The inclusion-exclusion criteria, how you get into a clinical trial, is going to be different from company to company. So if you're interested, you should connect, find out whether you want to go through all the questions to figure out that you're eligible. I think it's an important time for the family to regroup and say, okay, how much effort did this take? Did somebody have to walk away from their job in order to be able to sustain clinical trial participation? Is that sustainable? There are patients who don't have the resources to participate in the research, and we acknowledge that. So I love the dedication, but I also don't want this to be too much of a burden. There's a balance. There's always a balance. The last piece of getting into your next trial, it has to do with the mechanism of action of the candidate therapy that they're testing.
Oh, good.
If you were in a sortilin inhibitor trial, you might not be able to get into another sortilin inhibitor trial, but you might be able to get into a trial that's testing a different mechanism of action. And you don't have to determine that yourself. It's the people who are receiving your intent to enroll who will help explain that and straighten it out for you. But those are the main things that determine whether you go on to another trial to participate. And, for instance, if you can't do another clinical trial, do consider these observational studies becoming part of all FTD, becoming part of GenFi. Or FPI now.
I think most all of our families jump on the GenFi and the all FTD because they are so valuable, learning as much about this disease as possible. I wanted you to address the one area where I think it's helpful for people to understand is that if you have finished a trial and you're looking to jump on another trial, for those families who are in what is called the AAV vector, those are kind of one and done. Once you're part of those trials, that's kind of the end and you hope that they are successful. Can you kind of talk about that framework? Because I think those trials don't really allow for people to jump into a second trial if it's discontinued or for whatever reason.
Thank you for bringing that up. So we're in an exciting time many times over. One of the reasons is that there's a way to alter the way your genetics are working. Once you have made an attempt to do so in an AAV trial, number one, like I said before, you can't try the same mechanism of action another time. So nobody's going to want to try to change your genetic expression twice. Changing your genetic expression of the disease may actually change you in a way that makes you different from someone who hadn't tried the AAV or other genetic therapy. And so until there are a lot of people with that story, we don't have a separate drug trial arm to accommodate people who would be manifesting different changes from people who never did anything else before. So there's a concept in multiple sclerosis of drug-naive participants. In multiple sclerosis, there have been quite a few medications to try for quite a long time. And some of those clinical trials will not take people who have already been taking one or two or the second or the third drug. They have to be drug naive. So in the future, there may be FTD clinical trials that are looking for gene therapy naive participants. So it's wonderful that there's so many different things to try, but it will change the landscape of how you go to a second trial.
Yeah, I think that's the beauty of where we are with progranulin and therapeutics is the landscape is changing. And it's going to be the Wild West, I think, for all of us as family members trying to figure out which pot of gold we're going to be after.
Well, speaking of pots of gold,
yeah.
let's talk about another reason why it's important to sign up for or at least get screened for clinical trials. This is some of I actually would say to friends when I got involved in the pharmaceutical industry, I've had to grow up and realize that money is important. These sponsors who are going forward in frontotemporal dementia, a lot of them do not have other products that they've created in the past that they sell through prescriptions as a source of income. So they're actually raising funds to conduct a trial through investors. And I think everybody can identify with it when I put it this plainly. But if an investor says, yeah, I think that sounds great, it'll be awesome if this drug works. But if nobody shows up to volunteer to be in the trial's going nowhere and that money gets wasted. So the faster a sponsor can fill the study and complete the study, more investors will be excited and interested in backing the research efforts. So the fact that Alector was able to fill and complete the study gave investors confidence in the other sponsors who have come from the other ranks. So whatever you can do to help, there's also a dollars and cents mission to this. So thank you for helping keep this engine moving forward. That's what we all want. Getting to an answer is important, even if the answer is no, this didn't work.
Well, for me, I was just fascinated at how many progranulin families are out there. There are more than we thought were out there. Sure, everyone says it's rare, but it may not be. It may be that the more people that get genetically tested, the numbers will go up. And now that we know that Alector proved such a success in finding families across the globe, I think the horizon actually is quite bright for all of us. Would you just share with the progranulin community some parting thoughts?
It's just a privilege to be able to address the troops. First of all, thank you. Thank you for not giving up. And number two, don't give up on the sponsors who are working hard to bring you more clinical trials. There's more researchers working on this than ever before. And I have to say, when I was in training, I thought maybe we'd get to a cure to Alzheimer's disease, but that FTD would remain in the shadows and no one would gather up funds to do research for therapies in FTD. But look where we are. That's so cool. So I am sorry that the Alector trial did not find a difference between placebo and drug, but it was such an exciting thing to be part of that first foray into the wilderness. I mean, you brought up the frontier. It is much less the Wild West now than it was before because we have bridges and the Pony Express. So it's really a good time. The most important thing for CureGRN, I want you to be loud. I want you to put FTD into the ears of decision makers, whether that's our politicians, our Medicare funders, the FDA. Not enough people know about this yet. And if you stay with it and you help us to learn from your experience, we can get to where we want to go. It takes time, it takes resilience, it takes collaboration.
Wow. Well, I think on that wonderful note, I'd like to sincerely thank you for sharing your insights and your passion with us today, Dr. Chow. Your leadership in paving the way for a stronger FTD community, wow, is really one that connects us, families, science, and clinicians in such a really shared mission. And I know you're cheerleading all of our families on and onward and upward, shall we say. So thank you so much for your time and for making this in such a clear way that we get it. And
I hope so. I really hope so.
Thanks for being a champion. Appreciate you. See everybody. Thanks for joining us today. There'll be more CureGRN webinars coming up, so stay tuned.